U.S. President's 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminium imports into the country took effect today. The European Union retaliated with the move, which affects $28 billion worth of EU exports into the U.S. The countermeasures will come into effect in April. India's Steel Secretary Sandeep Pondrik has said that the duties won't impact the country much as it exports less than 1 lakh tons of steel to the U.S. China also responded to the tariffs, saying it will resolutely counter the measures. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has said that the move has violated World Trade Organization rules. America imports very little steel from China directly. Trump has already imposed a 20% across-the-board tariff on Chinese imports. The U.S. president had cited Beijing's alleged failure to curb the export of fentanyl to the U.S. to justify the tariff levy. Beijing hit back soon after, with tariffs on 10 to 15% on numerous U.S. agricultural goods. The tariffs went into effect on Monday. Last month, China had announced a 10% tariff on crude oil and a 15% levy on coal and LNG. So how will Beijing respond now? To take this forward, I'm now joined by the Wall Street Journal's China Bureau Chief, Jonathan Cheng. Thank you very much for joining us, Jonathan. Today, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson in China has said that China will use all possible measures to retaliate against the 25% tariff on steel and aluminium imports into the U.S. The tariffs were already there on China, so this is going to be over and above. What are some of the steps that you're expecting the Chinese government to take in the days to come?
That's a great question, and I think some in Beijing are probably asking themselves that very same question. Of course, there are a lot of tools that China can use. They've shown off some of them already, regulatory measures against U.S. companies, raising tariffs on, of course, things that they import from the U.S. But I think the real question is not what can they do. The question is what should they do? What pace of response should they have? Because obviously we may just be in the early rounds of this tariff war, and you don't want to use all your ammunition so quickly. So I think that's the difficult part here, is figuring out where we are in the ladder of escalation. It's also interesting because when we saw the first round of additional 10% tariffs on all Chinese exports to the U.S., that was just a few weeks ago. China was the only country targeted there. In this case, it's not China that's being targeted in particular, but China is getting hit like everybody else. As you mentioned, the EU has responded. So I think China just really needs to calibrate what their response is going to be.
Right. What I'd also like to ask you is, how does this change China's position as the largest producer of steel in the global supply chain?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a big question. I mean, China has relied on steel to help prop up its economy. Obviously, if you look more broadly at the Chinese economy, they have a lot of issues. Property is one big piece of that. And steel, of course, would have fed a lot of the apartment buildings and towers that are no longer going up, or are not going up as quite as quick a pace. Of course, like every other country, China needs to think about employment. They have to think about their population and how they're going to feed themselves and what their level of satisfaction with the government is. So they do need to talk tough. They do need to show that they're responsive. But again, I think the big question really is, how do they send a message back when you know that this is just, I mean, this is the third hit that China has taken so far in just the last few months, but there may be a long road ahead. I mean, Donald Trump said on the campaign trail that he was looking at tariffs of 60% on all Chinese goods. So you're only about a third of the way there. You don't want to use it all. And I think the other thing is, we've reported that Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are talking, or their people are talking about a potential summit. If they do have a summit meeting, of course, you're going to expect a lot of horse trading, a lot of negotiations behind the scenes, and this is probably part of it. So it's a complex calculation. I don't think that they're going to just do something reflexively, because it does need to feed into all these other larger considerations.
Right. Jonathan, we also hear that it's quite possible that US and China will reach an agreement, a deal very soon. When do you expect that summit to happen?
Well, we've reported that it could be in June, and the reason why is Donald Trump and Xi Jinping's birthdays are separated by just one day. I mean, they're 7 years apart, but I believe it's June 14th and 15th. So that is one idea that's being bandied about. Of course, things can change. There's a negotiation about the negotiations. It's possible that one side or the other will want to have the summit come sooner, because you don't want this situation to drag on. On the other hand, I mean, when you compare it with Trump's first term, I think China here is very much in the same boat as many other countries. I mean, in the first trade war, it really was targeting China, but now you have traditional allies of the U.S., neighbors of the U.S. that are being targeted. And so there may be a different strategy here as China maybe says, well, maybe we have an advantage here. We can work with Canada, Mexico. I don't know what exactly they're thinking about, but there are a lot of things that both sides want from the other. And so we'll see whether or not a deal can materialize.
Right. And finally, if we were to ask you about what's happened with Walmart, there have been reports that many American companies are seeking lower prices from Chinese suppliers in the context of tariffs that the US is imposing worldwide and also on China. There have been some reports that Chinese government officials called Walmart officials for a meeting to discuss this. Could you give us a sense of what's happening, what was conveyed to Walmart, what was the nature of the meeting?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this was reported in Chinese state media, so that is quite official. I think what happens is when you have the Trump administration slapping tariffs now of an additional 20% on all Chinese exports to the U.S., somebody needs to pay that. Of course, the importers will pay that to the U.S. government, but at the same time, they're either going to have to swallow the extra cost, take the hit to the profit margin, or they're going to have to pass it along to the consumers, or they're going to try to force the exporters to take some of it. So I think what China's responding to here is that when you have a company as big as Walmart, when they make orders for products, for goods from China, they have a lot of bargaining power. In the same way that the U.S. on a national level has a lot of bargaining power, has a lot of power to basically throw its weight around. And so if you have Walmart trying to protect its margins as well as not pass along costs to its consumers in the U.S., then the only place where that is going to manifest itself is on the Chinese exporters. So our understanding is that indeed Walmart, Target, Sam's Club, some of these big U.S. retailers are trying to do this and ask their Chinese suppliers to basically not raise prices on them or even to cut prices. And I think China here is stepping in and saying, you can't have your government bully us with these exports or with these tariffs, and then also have your companies try and push the cost of that onto us. So there's dynamics happening at every level here, and I think it remains to be seen how this will all play out. But certainly the tariffs that have now been imposed are putting a lot of strain on this global supply chain and on a lot of the way that global commerce has been done for the last 20, 30 years.
Right. Jonathan Cheng, thank you so much for joining us here on CNBC TV18, giving us your view on the tariff wars and China's reaction to US tariffs that came into effect on steel and aluminium today. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of News Center. More news and updates continue right here.